The air over Germany, 1944, was not empty. It was a substance, a thick and violent medium of ice and metal. At 25,000 feet, inside the trembling aluminum skin of a B-17 Flying Fortress, the cold was a physical invasion. It seeped through electrically heated suits, biting into bone. The air itself was thin, tasting of dry oxygen masks and static electricity. And then there was the sound, a perpetual, deafening cathedral of noise built from 4 roaring Wright cyclone engines, the shriek of wind through open gun ports, and the constant, low-frequency vibration that made your teeth ache. This was the environment. This was the killing field. And on this particular morning, the field was crowded. A formation of B-17s, a seemingly invincible armada, was in its death throes. Flak had already peppered the group, leaving black blossoms of smoke lingering in the high-altitude air like funeral flowers. Then came the hunters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, sleek and lethal, fell from the sun. Their cannons flashed, and with each flash, a .50 caliber round of pure terror ripped through the formation. A fortress to the left took a direct hit in the wing root, it folded upwards with a grotesque, slow-motion grace before the entire aircraft dissolved into a fireball and spinning debris. Inside the B-17 Yankee Lady, Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith, a ball turret gunner who had been, until recently, a mild-mannered postal worker from Michigan, felt the concussions through the fuselage. He was suspended in a plexiglass sphere beneath the bomber's belly, a man in a glass egg, staring down at a world of cloud and terror. He saw the tracers. He saw the fighters weaving through the bomber stream, their propeller discs shimmering circles of death. He saw the other gunners firing, their movements frantic, desperate. The interphone was a chaos of shouted warnings, curses, and the static-laced voice of the pilot trying to hold the formation together. Fighters. 6 o'clock high. Bandits at 3 o'clock level. Maynard's world was the world below. The ball turret was the most isolated, most vulnerable position on the ship. To enter it, you had to crawl through a narrow hatch and pull it shut above you, becoming a part of the machine itself. There was no parachute in here. In a crisis, you depended on someone in the fuselage to remember you, to crank the turret until the guns were pointing straight down, and open the hatch to let you out. If the hydraulic system failed, you were trapped. If the ship broke apart, you went down with your spherical coffin. He heard the distinct, terrifying sound of 20mm cannon shells ripping into his own aircraft. Thump thump thump. The plane shuddered violently. The smell of cordite, sharp and acrid, filtered down from above, mixed with the coppery scent of fear and the ever-present odor of oil and cold metal. A red warning light flickered on his panel. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. His turret was slowing down, its traverse becoming sluggish. Then, the interphone went dead. Not with a crackle, but with a sudden, absolute silence that was more frightening than any noise. The shouts, the warnings, the pilot's calm commands, all gone. He was alone. Cut off. The only sound was the roar of the engines and the wind, and now, the persistent hammering of a Bf-109's machine guns focusing on the wounded bomber. He was a sitting duck. His turret was all but useless. Standard procedure was to get out, to crawl back into the relative safety of the fuselage and man a handheld gun. But there was no one to crank him out. No one to answer his calls. He was sealed in. He looked down through the plexiglass. The world spun slowly beneath him, patches of green and brown earth, rivers like silver threads, all framed by the twisting, burning wreckage of falling bombers and the relentless, swarming enemy. This was the moment. The silence. The isolation. The certain knowledge of death. And in that silence, a thought, clear and insane, cut through the fear. What if I stop following the rules? He looked at his 2.50 caliber machine guns. He looked at the failing hydraulic controls. He looked at the attacking fighter, now lining up for another, final pass. He took a deep breath of the thin, cold air. And he made a decision. The rules were written in training manuals by men who had never sat in a freezing sphere of plexiglass, watching death approach in the shape of a grey German fighter. The rules said to use the hydraulic controls to traverse the turret smoothly, to lead the target, to fire in controlled, 3-second bursts to avoid overheating the barrels. The rules were a relic of a past that no longer existed. Maynard's hydraulics were failing. The usual responsive hum of the system was now a labored, groaning whine. He could feel the resistance in the handles, the sluggish response as he tried to pivot the turret to track a 109 streaking past. It was like moving through hardening cement. Standard procedure was clear: if the ball turret fails, evacuate. But the interphone was dead. The hatch above him was sealed. There was no evacuation. The Bf-109 that had just made a pass was banking hard to the left, its pilot undoubtedly confident that the fortress was a mortally wounded bird, ready to be finished off. It was coming around for the kill shot, aiming for the cockpit, the engines, the heart of the plane. Maynard's hands, encased in thick electrically heated gloves, gripped the control handles. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He had one advantage, a single, insane variable the German pilot would never account for. The ball turret was not just a defensive weapon. It was a pivot point. And with the hydraulics failing, it had become unpredictable. He didn't try to traverse the turret smoothly. Instead, he jerked the controls, feeding what little hydraulic pressure remained in short, violent bursts. The turret didn't swing, it lurched. It was a jarring, stop-start motion that would have been condemned by any gunnery instructor. But it was unpredictable. The German pilot, expecting a smooth arc of defensive fire, saw instead a stuttering, jerky movement from the ball turret. He adjusted his turn, a slight, almost instinctive correction. It was all Maynard needed. In that split second of the pilot's recalculation, Maynard fired. The .50 calibers roared, a sound that was swallowed by the engine noise but felt through his entire body. The tracers, every fifth round a glowing red streak, leapt from the muzzles. He didn't fire a burst. He fired a storm. The rules about barrel overheating were a concern for a future that might not come. The barrels could melt for all he cared, he needed to fill the sky with lead. A line of incendiary rounds walked through the air and found the 109's cockpit. There was no explosion, not at first. A puff of smoke, a flicker of flame, then the aircraft seemed to stagger in mid-air, its graceful bank turning into a death slide. It rolled onto its back and fell away, a dying bird trailing black smoke. Silence in the turret. The only sound was his own ragged breathing inside his oxygen mask. 1. The number didn't register as a victory. It registered as a confirmation. The tactic, this jarring, hydraulic jerking, rule-breaking madness, was his only language now. He was no longer a gunner following procedure. He was a man operating a flawed, trapped weapon with sheer, unadulterated will. He pivoted the turret, another jerking motion, scanning the deadly ballet around him. The sky was a canvas of violence. He saw another B-17, its vertical stabilizer sheared off, spinning down in a flat, helpless spiral. He saw parachutes, tiny white flowers blooming against the vast blue. So few. Always so few. Then, 2 more 109s. They were coordinating, coming in from different angles, one high and to the right, the other low and to the left. A classic pincer movement designed to split the defensive fire. The top gunner and the waist gunners in Yankee Lady were firing, their tracers crisscrossing, but the fighters were too fast, their angles too sharp. Maynard made a calculation that defied all logic. He ignored the one on the left. He focused entirely on the one diving from the right. He let the turret drift, not fighting the sluggish hydraulics, but using their lethargy. He waited. The 109 grew in his sight, its nose glowing with the fire of its own cannons. He could feel the impacts as the German shells walked across the wing root of his own plane. The vibration traveled through the fuselage, into the turret's mount, into his very possible second. Until the fighter was so close he could see the black crosses on the wings, the faint outline of the pilot's helmeted head. Then he jerked the turret upwards and fired. The burst was point blank. The .50 caliber rounds, capable of piercing armor, tore into the engine and cockpit of the Messerschmitt. The aircraft didn't so much explode as disintegrate. A wing tore free, spinning wildly. The fuselage became a tornadic cloud of metal fragments and fuel. Maynard flinched, instinctively ducking as pieces of the enemy fighter rattled against his plexiglass dome like hellish hail. 2. The second 109, the one he had ignored, was now screaming in from the left. It was perfectly positioned. It had a clean shot at the B-17's vulnerable belly. At him. There was no time to traverse the turret. The hydraulics were too slow. He was out of moves. A thought, cold and clear, this is it. But then, a miracle. A burst of .50 caliber fire from the Yankee Lady's tail gunner stitched across the 109's flight path. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was enough. The German pilot, startled, broke off his attack, pulling up sharply to avoid the fire. He flashed over the top of the B-17, his shadow a fleeting darkness over Maynard's turret. The reprieve was measured in heartbeats. The formation was breaking. The bomber stream was being shredded. The lead plane in their group took a direct flak hit and vanished in a ball of fire. Without the lead navigator and the formation's protective fire, the remaining planes were easy prey. The German fighters swarmed like wolves on a wounded caribou. Maynard's world shrank to the view through his gunsight. He became a machine of instinct and reaction. He stopped thinking in terms of strategy or survival. He thought only in terms of motion and lead. See a gray shape. Jerk the turret. Fire a storm. See it fall. A 109 made a head-on pass against the formation. Maynard fired a long, continuous burst, walking his tracers into its path. The fighter flew right through the wall of bullets. It emerged on the other side, streaming coolant, and rolled away, dying. 3. Another came from below, a risky maneuver aiming for the bomb bay. Maynard stomped on the foot pedals, lurching the turret downward. He fired until his guns fell silent, an overheated barrel or an empty ammunition box. He didn't know which. He didn't care. The 109, riddled with holes, nosedived into the abyss below. 4. The battle became a blur of noise, vibration, and violent, jerky movements. The air inside the turret was thick with the smell of burnt cordite and hot metal. His face was stinging from the cold and the spent powder gases leaking back into his compartment. Time lost all meaning. It stretched and compressed. A minute felt like an hour felt like a second. He was aware of a new sound. A deep, shrieking whine that was different from the engines. He looked up, through the top of his plexiglass dome. The sight froze the blood in his veins. Not one, but 3 Bf-109s were lining up in a shallow dive, one after the other. A train of death. They were not aiming for the wings or the engines. They were aiming for the fuselage. For a sustained, concentrated kill. They were going to saw the Yankee Lady in half. The first one fired. Cannon shells ripped into the radio room, the waist section. Maynard saw debris, a sheet of aluminum, a piece of equipment, fly past his turret. He heard a scream, faint and distorted, through the metal above him. Then the interphone crackled, sputtered, and for a single, blessed second, came to life. It was the waist gunner's voice, choked and desperate. They're ripping us apart. I'm hit. Oh God, I'm hit. The voice was cut off by a burst of static. The second 109 began its firing run. This was the end. He could feel it. The entire aircraft shuddered like a living thing in its death throes. He looked at his ammunition counter. He was low. Maybe one more good burst. He made a decision. He wouldn't die cowering in his sphere. He would die spitting fire. He waited for the second fighter to finish its pass. He let it go. He conserved his ammunition. He focused everything on the third and final fighter in the line. The one that would deliver the coup de grace. The third 109 steadied itself. It was coming in straight and level, a perfect, unflinching trajectory. The pilot was taking his time, ensuring the kill. Maynard did not jerk the turret. He did not try to be unpredictable. He simply pointed his guns directly at the approaching fighter and held down the triggers. The two streams of fire met in the middle. American .50 calories and German 20 mm cannon shells passed each other in the frigid air. Tracers converged. For a moment, it seemed the universe had narrowed to this single, violent intersection. Maynard's rounds found their mark first. They smashed into the nose of the 109, shattering the propeller, chewing into the engine. The fighter's own cannon fire went wild, a final, spasmodic burst that arced harmlessly over the B-17's tail. The Messerschmitt, mortally wounded, seemed to hang in the air for an impossible moment. Then it dropped its nose and plunged, a comet of fire and failed ambition, toward the earth far below. 5. The guns fell silent. The ammo was spent. The barrels were smoking, likely warped beyond use. Maynard sat in his turret, suspended in a sudden, shocking quiet. The roar of the engines was still there, but the hammering of the guns was gone. The frantic shouts on the interphone were gone. He looked around. The swarm was gone. The German fighters, low on fuel and ammunition, were breaking off, leaving the shattered bomber stream to limp home or die trying. He craned his neck, looking up through the hatch. He saw a face, the radio operator, pale and blood-smeared, peering down at him. The man gave a weak, exhausted thumbs up. They were still flying. Maynard Smith slowly, carefully, released his grip on the control handles. His hands were trembling, the adrenaline receding, leaving a vast, hollow emptiness inside him. He had just fought the most intense 4 minutes of his life. He had fired over 1,500 rounds of ammunition. He had watched 5 aircraft fall from the sky by his hand. But in the silence, a chilling question began to form, cutting through the fatigue and the fading terror. What had he become in that glass cage? And what would he have to become to survive the journey home? The silence after the battle was a different kind of assault. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy, ringing pressure in the ears that amplified every creak and groan of the wounded aircraft. The roar of the engines now sounded labored, wounded. A desperate, straining hum. Maynard remained in his ball turret, a fossil sealed in amber. He was shivering, not from the cold, but from the slow, creeping return of feeling to a body that had been, for 4 minutes, pure instrument. He looked at his hands. They were still locked in a phantom grip around the control handles. He willed them to relax, finger by finger. The gloves were smudged with gun oil and the metallic dust from spent shell casings. He became aware of a sharp, coppery taste in his mouth. He'd bitten his cheek at some point during the fight, and now the blood mingled with the stale oxygen, a primal flavor of fear and survival. The interphone crackled back to life, a weak, ghostly signal. It was the pilot, Captain John R. Jack Kessler. His voice, usually a steady, Midwestern drawl, was thin and stretched. Crew report. Sound off. Navigator. Here, skip. A shaky voice, bombardier. Here. Radio. A long pause. Then, a cough. Radio, here. Gonzalez is, he's gone, skip. A beat of static-filled silence, top turret. Here. Waist gunners. Another pause. Port side here. Starboard. I think Miller's dead, Captain. The whole section's torn to hell. Ball turret. Maynard keyed his mic. His own voice sounded foreign to him, a dry rasp. Smith. Here. Tail. Tail gunner here. Took some shrapnel, but I'm operational. The list of the dead hung in the air, unspoken. 2. Maybe 3. Gone in the time it takes to boil a kettle of water. The math of it was brutal. They had lost men. He had killed men. The two facts existed in him, side by side, not yet reconciling. They were just raw data, points of impact on his soul. Okay, listen up, Kessler's voice cut through, all business, a lifeline of procedure. We've got multiple engine fires, now contained, but we're losing oil pressure on number 2. Hydraulics are shot to hell. Controls are heavy. We're leaving the formation. We can't keep pace. Navigator, plot us a course for the nearest friendly field. Any field. We are not going to make it back to Bassingbourn. The reality of their situation settled like a weight. A lone B-17 over occupied Europe was a death sentence. It was a wounded animal separated from the herd, and the wolves were never far away. They had lost the protective umbrella of the formation's combined firepower. They were naked. A new sound began, a slow, rhythmic clunk 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 from above. Maynard looked up. The radio operator was manually craning the turret. The mechanism was slow, protesting, but it was moving. The guns pivoted downward, and then the hatch above his head swung open. Cold air from the fuselage, thick with the smells of blood, smoke, and spent explosives, washed over him. You alive down there, Smitty? It was the radio operator, a kid named Petrovich. His face was pale, a smear of soot and something darker across his cheek. Maynard didn't answer. He unplugged his electrical suit and oxygen, and with stiff, aching muscles, hauled himself out of the spherical coffin. The transition from the isolated world of the turret to the chaos of the fuselage was a sensory shock. The noise was louder here, more immediate. The wind howled through a dozen jagged holes in the aluminum skin. The metal floor was slick with hydraulic fluid and blood. He saw it, a dark, sticky pool near the waist gun position. His legs numb. He passed the radio room. The operator's chair was empty. Gonzalez was gone. He saw a single, lonely .50 caliber shell casing rolling back and forth with the movement of the plane. He reached the waist section. The scene was one of utter devastation. The starboard side was a gaping maw of torn metal. The gun was gone, twisted into a useless sculpture. And there was Miller. Or what was left of him. He was covered with a flak jacket, a feeble, respectful gesture. A boot stuck out from underneath it. The portside waist gunner, a kid from Oklahoma named Dobbs, was sitting on an ammunition box, his face blank, staring at nothing. His left sleeve was torn, and a crude bandage was wrapped around his forearm, already soaking through with red. Dobbs, Maynard said, his voice still a rasp. Dobbs didn't look at him. He just disappeared. 1 second he was firing, the next, there was just a hole. He finally turned his eyes to Maynard. They were wide, shocky. I saw you, Smitty. I saw you get those krauts. Jesus. It was something else. Maynard didn't feel like it was something else. He felt hollow. He looked at the blood on the floor, then out the gaping hole at the passing clouds. The two images wouldn't align. The heroic narrative Dobbs was trying to build crumbled against the reality of Miller's body under a flak jacket. He made his way forward, toward the cockpit. He needed to see. He needed to understand the machine they were trapped in. He passed the top turret, where the engineer gave him a grim nod. He climbed into the relative silence of the cockpit. Captain Kessler was a study in concentration, his hands gripping the yoke, his shoulders tense. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Fields, was working the throttles and gauges, his face a mask of focused anxiety. The plane was flying, but it was a struggle. It listed slightly to the right, and the controls were fighting them every inch of the way. Kessler glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Maynard's. There was no praise in them. No celebration. There was only a shared, grim understanding. How bad is it back there, Smith? Kessler asked, his eyes returning to the windscreen. Miller and Gonzalez are Kia, sir, Maynard reported, the military acronym feeling sterile and inadequate. Dobbs is wounded. The starboard waist is gone. Turret hydraulics are shot. Kessler just nodded. We've got a runaway prop on number 2. Feathering mechanism is damaged. She's vibrating herself to pieces. If we can't get it under control, it'll tear the whole wing off. The navigator, hunched over his chart table, called out. Best bet is a field in Belgium, Skip. Near the coast. It's a gamble. Intel says it's still in Allied hands, but that could change by the hour. It's the only gamble we've got, Kessler said. Plot the course. Fields, see if you can get more RPM out of number 3 and 4. We need all the push we can get. Maynard stood there for a moment, a ghost in the machinery of survival. He looked out the cockpit window. The world below was peaceful, green, and quiet. A pastoral landscape utterly divorced from the metal hell they were inhabiting. He saw a river, a small village, a church spire. It looked like Michigan. It looked like home. And in that moment, the memory surfaced. Not of the fight, but of what came before. A memory of the briefing room, just hours ago. The intelligence officer, a crisp major with a pointer stick, standing before a large map of Europe. The Luftwaffe is deploying new tactics, the major had said, tapping the map. They're concentrating on stragglers. A wounded B-17 is a trophy. They will hunt you. They will test you. Your greatest weapon is not your .50 calories, gentlemen. It is your formation. Stay in the herd. The herd is safety. The herd was gone. They were the straggler now. The memory shifted. To the gunnery instructor in Texas, a sergeant with a permanent squint. Controlled bursts, boys. 3 seconds. Any longer and you warp the barrel, you waste ammunition, and you give away your position with a constant muzzle flash. You are not a spray and pray artist. You are a precision instrument. Maynard had been anything but precise. He had been a storm. A chaotic, jerking, ammunition-wasting storm. He had violated every principle he'd been taught. And he was alive because of it. The contradiction was a cold knot in his stomach. The army had trained him to be one thing. The sky had demanded he be another. He made his way back to the waist section. Dobbs was still sitting there, but he had a job now. He was watching the sky, a handheld signal flare pistol in his lap, their pathetic defense against any new attackers. The wind howled through the hole where his friend had died. Maynard sat down on the floor, his back against the cold metal fuselage. He closed his eyes. The image that came to him was not of the falling German planes. It was of the last one, the one he'd killed in that head-on duel. He saw the cockpit. For a fraction of a second, he had seen the pilot. A dark shape, a helmet. A man. He had killed a man. Then another. And another. 5 men. He had been a postal worker. He sorted mail. He knew the people on his route. Old Mrs. Henderson who always had a cookie for him. The Johnson boys with their dog that would bark at his uniform. He handled letters, birthday cards, love notes. His hands were meant for paper, not for triggers. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands again. They were the same hands. But they were not. The plane shuddered violently, a new, alarming vibration. The runaway propeller was getting worse. The sound was a rising, screaming whine that promised a terrible conclusion. Captain Kessler's voice came over the interphone, calm but laced with a finality that made everyone freeze. All right, crew. Listen up. We're not going to make Belgium. That vibration is going to shake the wing off in the next 10 minutes. we're going to have to put her down. Navigator, find me a field. Any field. We're going in. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. The battle was over. A new trial was about to begin. The trial of the earth. And Maynard Harrison Smith, the man who had defied death in the sky, now had to face the terrifying prospect of the ground. The scream of the runaway propeller was a living thing, a metallic beast tearing itself apart inside the engine nacelle. Each vibration was a hammer blow against the wing spar, a promise of structural failure. The B-17 Yankee Lady was no longer an aircraft, it was a collection of tortured parts held together by hope and fraying cables. The transition from the lethal expanse of the sky to the looming, unyielding earth was a psychological freefall. The ground, which had been a distant mosaic, now rushed up to meet them with terrifying detail. Individual trees separated from the green blur. A church spire became a spear aimed at their belly. The peaceful quilt of farmland became a potential coffin. Inside the fuselage, the crew moved with a frantic, choreographed desperation. This was the drill they had practiced but never believed they would execute. Jettison everything. Lighten the ship. Maynard, his body still humming with the ghost echo of the guns, joined Dobbs at the gaping hole in the waist. They grabbed anything not bolted down, ammo boxes, flak jackets, the shattered remains of the starboard gun, and hurled them into the slipstream. Each object tumbled away, a piece of their identity as a war machine discarded. He saw Dobbs's hands shaking as he threw out a box of .50 caliber rounds, the very tools of their trade, now just dead weight. The wind snatched at their clothing, trying to pull them out into the void. Pilot to crew. Brace for impact. Find something solid. It's going to be rough. Kessler's voice was a flat line of control, a stark contrast to the screaming metal around them. The world tilted violently as Kessler fought for a semblance of a glide slope. The fields below were not the pristine, endless runways of England. They were small, hemmed in by hedgerows and ditches, crisscrossed with stone walls. The navigator had picked a likely-looking patch of green, but from this altitude, it was impossible to tell if it was soft pasture or a rock-strewn death trap. Maynard scrambled forward, away from the treacherous hole. He found a sturdy crossmember near the radio room, wrapping his arms and legs around it like a sailor lashed to a mast in a storm. He met the eyes of Petrovich, the radio operator, who had done the same. No words were exchanged. Their faces were pale canvases of fear. Petrovich's lips were moving silently. A prayer. Or maybe just a mantra to keep the terror at bay. The sound changed. The howl of the wind grew louder, more personal. The engines were cut, their roar replaced by a ghostly whistle. They were gliding now, a silent, heavy bird. The silence was the most frightening sound yet. It was the sound of fate taking over. Of physics asserting its absolute authority. Maynard closed his eyes. He didn't think of the war. He didn't think of the men he had killed. He thought of the smell of his mother's kitchen. Of the feel of cool grass on a summer afternoon. Of the weight of a mailbag slung over his shoulder. The mundane, precious textures of a life that now felt 1,000 years away. Crunch. The first impact was not violent, but deep and grating. The belly of the fortress kissed the earth, a screech of tearing aluminum. Then the world dissolved into a cacophony of breaking things. The second impact was a violent, jarring slam that threw him against his harness. His head snapped forward, his helmet cracking against the metal beam. Sparks of light exploded behind his eyelids. The aircraft was slewing, skidding, tearing itself apart around them. The sound was unimaginable, a symphony of destruction, a ripping, grinding, shattering roar that consumed the universe. He was a pebble in a tin can, shaken by a giant. He held on, his muscles screaming in protest. Something heavy, a tool chest, perhaps, broke loose and slammed into the bulkhead next to him. A piece of plexiglass from a window zipped past his face like a guillotine blade. The plane was spinning, the landscape a dizzying blur through the cracks in the fuselage. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The noise ceased, replaced by an ringing, absolute silence. It was broken by the sound of dripping, fuel, oil, hydraulic fluid. And a low, agonized moan from somewhere in the wreckage. Maynard untangled himself. His body ached everywhere. A sharp pain shot up his leg when he put weight on it. He tasted blood in his mouth again. But he was alive. The fuselage was canted at a steep angle. Daylight streamed in through a dozen new rents in the skin. He looked toward the cockpit. It was crushed, the nose section compacted like an accordion, his voice hoarse. Get out. Now. She could blow. The fear of fire was primal, a terror greater than any German fighter. A B-17 wreck was a tinderbox of fuel and oxygen. He stumbled toward the waist, where Dobbs was already kicking at the damaged fuselage, creating a larger exit. Petrovich was behind him, helping the navigator, who was clutching his arm, his face white with pain. They tumbled out of the wreckage, falling onto soft, damp earth. The smell was overwhelming, a rich, loamy scent of soil and crushed grass, mixed with the acrid stink of aviation fuel and scorched metal. Maynard rolled onto his back, gasping. The sky above was a serene, impossible blue. He could hear birds singing. The contrast was surreal. He had just fallen from that sky, a place of ice and death, into this peaceful, green world. For a long moment, they all just lay there, breathing, feeling the solid, unmoving ground beneath them. They were 7. 7 out of 10. The pilot, co-pilot, and bombardier were still in the crushed nose. A grim silence fell over them as they looked at the wreckage. Then, a sound. A cough. A shifting of metal. They scrambled to their feet, rushing toward the cockpit. Skip. Fields. Petrovich shouted. They pulled at twisted aluminum, their hands bleeding, ignoring the pain. After minutes of frantic work, they saw a movement. Captain Kessler was alive, pinned by the collapsed instrument panel but conscious. The co-pilot, Fields, was not moving. The bombardier was clearly gone. It took another 20 minutes of brutal, desperate effort to free Kessler. His leg was broken, a jagged bone protruding through his flight suit. He was in shock, his eyes wide and unfocused. The wing, the propeller, he mumbled. It's over, Skip, Maynard said, applying a makeshift tourniquet from a shredded parachute strap. We're down. They laid Kessler gently on the grass a safe distance from the wreck. The 7 survivors gathered around their captain, a ragged, bloody, shell-shocked circle. The navigator had a broken arm. Dobbs's gunshot wound was bleeding again. Maynard had a sprained ankle and a gash on his forehead. They were a mess. It was then that the reality of their situation descended, colder and heavier than any altitude. They were in occupied territory. The navigator, using his good arm, pulled out a escape map from his flight suit. Best guess, we're in northern France. Maybe 20 miles from the coast. The channel is there. He pointed a trembling finger. The Germans are everywhere. As if on cue, the distant sound of a vehicle engine cut through the pastoral quiet. It was a familiar, threatening sound, the grind of a military truck. Fear, a new and different kind, seized them. It was no longer the impersonal fear of flak or fighters. This was the intimate, close-quarters fear of capture. Of the Gestapo. Of a POW camp. Or worse. We need to move, Maynard said, his voice low and urgent. Now. We can't stay here. But where could they go? They were injured, in uniform, in the middle of enemy territory. They had a few sidearms, a signal flare pistol, and no food. Kessler couldn't walk. They dragged the captain into the cover of a nearby hedgerow, a thick, ancient wall of vegetation that offered a fragile veil of safety. From there, they watched as a German Kübelwagen, followed by a truck filled with soldiers, rolled into the field beside their wrecked bomber. The soldiers fanned out, efficient and professional, securing the area. They poked through the debris, collecting maps, equipment, and the personal effects of the dead. Maynard watched from the shadows, his heart pounding against his ribs. He saw a German officer pick up his flak helmet from the wreckage, the one with "Smitty" painted on the side. The officer turned it over in his hands, then tossed it back into the mud. They were hunters again. But this time, they were the prey. The memory of the gunnery instructor's voice came back, from a training lecture they'd all dismissed. If you're shot down, your war changes. It's no longer about fighting. It's about hiding. It's about silence. Your life depends on becoming a ghost. As the German soldiers continued their methodical search, moving closer to their hedgerow, Maynard Smith understood. The battle in the sky was over. The battle of silence had just begun. And in this new war, a jammed gun or a failed hydraulic line was the least of their problems. The real weapon was invisibility. And the cost of failure was not a quick death in the clouds, but something far, far worse. The hedgerow was a world of its own, a dense, tangled universe of roots, thorns, and damp, decaying leaves. The smell was rich and organic, a stark contrast to the metallic, chemical odors of the aircraft. It was the smell of life, of growth and decay, a cycle that had continued unabated for centuries, oblivious to the war raging in the skies above. Crouched within it, the 7 survivors of the Yankee Lady were not men anymore. They were animals. Their hearing was tuned to the slightest crack of a twig, their vision to the faintest movement in the shifting shadows. The sound of the German soldiers, their guttural voices and the crunch of their boots on the wreckage, was a constant, low-frequency terror. Maynard pressed his back against the damp earth, his sprained ankle throbbing with a hot, persistent pain. Next to him, Captain Kessler breathed in shallow, controlled gasps, his face a gray mask of agony. The bone in his leg was a white, shocking intrusion into the green gloom. Every few minutes, Petrovich would risk a glance through the foliage, reporting in a whisper that was barely audible. "They're loading the bodies, they've found the Norden bomb site housing, 2 men are coming this way." A wave of pure, undiluted fear washed over them. Maynard's hand went to the .45 pistol strapped to his hip. It felt absurdly small, a toy against the Mauser rifles the Germans carried. He knew the math. A firefight here would last seconds and end only one way. Their only hope was to remain part of the landscape, to be as still as the stones and the roots. The 2 German soldiers stopped maybe 10 yards from their hiding spot. They were young, one lighting a cigarette, the other scanning the hedgerow with bored, untroubled eyes. They spoke casually, their tone suggesting a routine cleanup operation. One of them gestured towards the very thicket the Americans were hidden in and laughed. Maynard's finger tightened on the trigger of his .45. He saw Dobbs, across from him, close his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. Then, a dog barked in the distance. One of the soldiers called out, and the 2 men turned and walked back towards the wreckage. The immediate threat had passed. The silence they left behind was thick with the residue of terror. Hours bled into one another. The light began to fade, the blue sky softening to lavender, then to a deep, star-dusted indigo. The Germans finished their work, loaded their trucks, and drove away. The field was left with the grotesque sculpture of the crashed B-17, a dark, skeletal silhouette against the twilight. They were alone. But the aloneness was even more frightening. "We can't stay here," the navigator, Lieutenant Hayes, whispered. His broken arm was cradled against his chest. "They'll have reported our crash. Patrols will be out at first light. We need to move Kessler. We need to find shelter." But where? They were 7 injured men in a hostile country, unable to speak the language, with no idea who to trust. The briefing on evasion techniques felt a lifetime away, a theoretical exercise. The reality was this cold, dark field and the overwhelming unknown that lay beyond it. It was Dobbs who saw it first. A flicker of light. A single, yellow point in the darkness, maybe half a mile away. It appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. A farmhouse. It's a risk, Hayes said, his voice tight. Could be collaborators. Could be a German billet. Could be our only chance, Maynard countered, his gaze fixed on that distant, hopeful pinprick. Kessler will die if we don't get him warm and get that leg set. We all will. The decision was made without a vote. It was a consensus born of utter desperation. They fashioned a crude stretcher from 2 branches and a parachute canopy. Moving under the cover of the moonless night, they became a slow, painful procession of shadows. Every rustle in the undergrowth sounded like a patrol. Every distant animal cry was a shouted alarm. Maynard, his ankle screaming with every step, helped carry the front of the stretcher. Kessler, biting on a piece of leather to keep from crying out, was a dead weight felt like a march across a continent. Time stretched and distorted. The single light became their polestar, their singular focus in a world of fear. As they drew closer, the details of the place emerged. A low, stone building with a sagging roof. A barn, its door hanging open on one hinge. A smell of manure and wood smoke. It was poor. It was isolated. It was perfect. They hid in the tree line at the edge of the property, watching. For an hour, nothing moved. Then, the door opened, and a figure emerged, an old man, stooped and slow, carrying a bucket. He moved with the weary rhythm of a man who has worked the land his entire life. There was no military precision here. No threat. I'll go, Maynard said quietly. He unbuckled his .45 and handed it to Petrovich. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, or if you hear shouting, get out of here. Leave us. He stepped out of the trees and into the open, his hands raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. The old man saw him immediately. He froze, the bucket dropping from his hand with a clatter. He didn't run. He didn't call out. He just stared, his face a landscape of wrinkles and resignation in the faint starlight. Maynard approached slowly, his mind racing through the few French phrases from his evasion training. Americain, he said, his voice a dry croak. He pointed to himself. Aviator. We are, crashed. He gestured back towards the trees. Blesses. Wounded. The old man's eyes darted from Maynard's face to the trees behind him, then back. His expression was unreadable. The silence stretched, taut and dangerous. Helping Allied airmen meant a one-way ticket to a concentration camp for him and his entire family. The calculation was happening behind those tired eyes. The risk. The cost. Then, the door opened again. A woman, perhaps his wife, stood there, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She saw Maynard, saw his flight jacket, his raised hands. She said one word, sharp and quiet, Vite. Quickly. It was all the invitation they needed. They stumbled out of the trees, carrying Kessler, a bedraggled, bloody group of invaders from the sky. The old woman herded them into the barn, her movements efficient and silent. She pointed to a loft filled with hay. The old man followed, bolting the barn door from the inside. There was no joyous welcome. No tears of gratitude. There was only a grim, practical necessity. The woman brought a basin of water and some ragged, clean cloths for bandages. The old man produced a bottle of clear, potent alcohol, Calvados. He poured it over Kessler's leg wound before Hayes, using skills from a forgotten first aid course, tried to set the bone. Kessler's scream was muffled by a wad of cloth shoved in his mouth. As Hayes worked, the old man approached Maynard. He looked at the gash on his forehead, the blood-soaked sleeve of his jacket. He pointed a gnarled finger at the Medal of Glory patch on his chest, then up towards the sky. He made a sweeping motion with his hand, like a plane falling, then held up 5 fingers. His eyebrows raised in a silent question. He knew. He had seen the dogfight. He had seen the 5 falling planes. Maynard simply nodded, too exhausted for pride or explanation. The old man looked at him for a long moment, his eyes ancient and knowing. He placed a hand on Maynard's shoulder, a gesture that was neither congratulatory nor pitying. It was something else. An acknowledgement. A passing of a burden. Then he turned and disappeared back into the farmhouse. Curled in the scratchy, sweet-smelling hay, listening to the sounds of the night and the ragged breathing of his wounded crew, Maynard felt the weight of that touch. He had been a hero in the air, a force of destruction. Here, on the ground, he was a scared boy, dependent on the mercy of strangers, his fate held in the hands of an old French farmer who risked everything for a reason Maynard could not fully comprehend. The silence of the barn was different from the silence of the turret. That had been the silence of isolation. This was the silence of connection, fragile and terrifying. It was the sound of the human network that lay beneath the war, a web of quiet courage and immense risk. And as he drifted into a fitful, haunted sleep, he understood that the 5 men he had killed were only part of the equation. The true cost of his actions was now here, in this barn, in the lives of these farmers. The war was not just in the sky. It was in this silence. And his debt was only growing. Dawn broke not with light, but with sound. The distant, metallic grind of more vehicles. The Americans in the hayloft froze, their breath catching in their throats. The barn door below creaked open. The old farmer stood there, holding a pitchfork. He didn't look at them. He simply began methodically forking hay into a pile, his movements slow and deliberate. A performance. A few minutes later, 2 German soldiers appeared in the doorway, their uniforms crisp in the gray morning light. They spoke in short, sharp sentences. The farmer shrugged, gestured with his hands, a picture of bucolic ignorance. He shook his head. Neen. He had seen nothing. The soldier's eyes scanned the barn, lingering on the shadows of the loft. Maynard held his breath, his hand resting on the cold metal of his .45. He could feel Dobbs trembling beside him. The moment stretched, thin and brittle as ice. Then, one of the soldiers nodded, turned, and they left. The farmer went back to his work, not looking up, not giving any sign. The performance was over. The risk had been immense. An hour later, the old woman brought them a pot of bitter chicory coffee and a loaf of coarse, dark bread. With her was a man they had not seen before. He was younger, perhaps in his 30s, with a quiet intensity in his eyes and a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He did not introduce himself. He simply looked at each of them, his gaze assessing, calculating risk. "You cannot stay," he said in heavily accented, but clear, English. "The Boche are doing a house-to-house search. They will be here by this afternoon." He was from the resistance. The réseau. The network of ghosts they had only heard about in briefings. He was their lifeline. "We have a truck. We will move the captain to a safe house in the next village. The rest of you, you will walk. Separately. You will be given directions. You will be given clothes." He opened his satchel and pulled out a bundle of worn, civilian clothing, rough wool trousers, patched jackets, berets. "You are no longer aviators. You are farmers. You are laborers. If you are stopped, you know nothing. You have no papers. You are lost. You are stupid Americans. Your lives, and our lives, depend on this." The transformation was humiliating and absolute. They stripped off their flight jackets, their uniforms, the symbols of their identity and their pride. They pulled on the rough, smelly clothes of French peasants. They smudged dirt on their faces. They became ghosts. The journey that followed was a descent into a new kind of warfare, a war of shadows and whispers. Maynard was paired with Petrovich. Their instructions were to follow a creek bed for 2 kilometers, then wait at a ruined mill for a woman on a bicycle. They walked in silence, their bodies tensed for the sound of a German patrol. Every rustle in the bushes was a threat. Every distant voice was a death sentence. They passed a German checkpoint on a bridge, their hearts in their throats, but they were waved through with a bored gesture by a soldier who saw only two more dirty Frenchmen. Exactly as promised. She never stopped pedaling, simply nodding for them to follow. She led them to a cellar beneath a cafe in a small, sleepy village. The air was thick with the smell of wine and damp stone. Captain Kessler was already there, his leg now properly splinted, his face less gray. The others trickled in over the next few hours. They were safe. For now. This was the pattern for the next week. Moving only at night. Hiding in attics, barns, root cellars. Their guides were a gallery of silent, brave faces, a priest who hid them in his church crypt, a schoolteacher who passed them off as cousins from a bombed-out city, a young couple who risked everything for people they had never met. The war, from this angle, was not about bombs and bullets. It was about a loaf of bread passed through a half-open door. A coded message on the radio. The absolute, terrifying trust placed in strangers. Maynard found himself changing. The frantic energy of the ball turret, the explosive violence, had no place here. Here, the currency was patience. Silence. Stillness. He learned to read the small tells in a person's face, a flicker of fear, a hint of deception. He learned that courage was not always loud. Sometimes, it was the quiet click of a lock turning after you were safely inside. One night, in a dusty attic, Petrovich whispered to him in the dark. "I can't stop seeing it, Smitty. Gonzalez. Just, gone." Maynard stared at the slivers of moonlight coming through the roof tiles. "I see them too," he said, his voice low. "The ones who fell. The German pilots. I see their planes going down. Every time I close my eyes." It was the first time he had admitted it. The guilt was not a sharp sting, but a dull, constant ache. He had done what he had to do to save his crew, his friends. But the cost was etched into him, a ledger of lives ended by his hand. The French families risked their lives for a hero. But he did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had been forced to become a monster to fight monsters. Their final guide was a man named Luke, a former fisherman with hands like weathered rope. He was to take them to the coast, where a fishing boat would run the German patrols and take them across the channel to England. The journey to the coast was the most dangerous leg. The area was heavily fortified, swarming with patrols. They moved through a landscape of fear, clinging to the shadows of the Atlantic Wall. Luke was a phantom, knowing every path, every ditch, every moment when the searchlights swept the beaches. They crouched in the cold sand, the smell of salt and rotting seaweed in their noses, watching the dark silhouette of the fishing boat bobbing in the swells just beyond the surf. Then, the lights. A German patrol, 2 soldiers with a dog, walking the beach. They were trapped. There was no cover. The dog barked, a sharp, excited sound that carried over the crash of the waves. Luke didn't hesitate. He looked at Maynard, then at the others. He pointed to the boat, then made a running motion. Then he stood up. He started walking away from them, towards the patrol, shouting in drunken, slurred French, waving a bottle of wine he produced from his coat. He was creating a diversion. A suicide mission. The German soldiers turned, focusing on the noisy, belligerent drunk. The dog strained at its leash, now. Maynard hissed. They ran. 7 ghosts scrambling across the sand, their injured legs screaming in protest, their hearts pounding. They plunged into the icy, shocking water, wading, then swimming towards the boat. Hands reached down, hauling them over the gunwale, onto the deck slick with fish scales. As the boat's engine sputtered to life and they began to pull away, Maynard looked back. He saw the flash of a rifle butt. He saw Luke fall to the sand. The soldiers stood over him. Then, the searchlight swept past, and the beach was swallowed by darkness. They had escaped. The cost was another life. Another debt. The return to England was a blur of debriefings, medical checks, and muted congratulations. They were given clean uniforms, hot food, and beds that didn't shake with the sound of artillery. But the war was not over for them. It was inside them. It was in a hangar office at Bassingbourn that the full scope of Maynard's actions in the sky finally came to light. The intelligence officers had pieced together reports from other crews, from gun camera footage, from German radio intercepts. Staff Sergeant Smith, the colonel said, spreading photographs and documents on a desk. That engagement on your final mission, we've been able to confirm it. The Luftwaffe lost 12 aircraft in that sector in a 4-minute window. 12. All Bf-109s. Gun cameras from the Yankee ladies surviving waist gun and tail gun confirm your turret was the source of the fire that destroyed at least 8 of them. The other 4 are listed as probables, but given the tactics described in the after-action reports, we're crediting you with all 12. The number hung in the air. 12. In 4 minutes. It was an unimaginable feat, a record. A legend in the making. Maynard looked at the photographs. They were not of burning aircraft. They were grainy, blown-up images of the faces of the French farmers, of Luke on the beach, of the silent, brave men and women of the resistance. He saw the cost, not the victory. He had been a postman from Michigan. He had become a killer in a glass ball. He had become a ghost in a stolen coat. And now, they wanted to make him a hero. He stood up, his body still aching from the crash, his soul heavier than any metal they could pin on his chest. With all due respect, sir, he said, his voice quiet but steady. The credit belongs to the crew of the Yankee Lady. To the men we lost. And to the people on the ground who bought our freedom with theirs. He walked out of the office, into the damp English air. The war was still roaring all around him, but for the first time, he heard the silence within it. The silence of the dead. The silence of the grateful. The silence of a man who had looked into the abyss, and knew that a part of him would never truly return. The story of Maynard Smith is not just a tale of aerial combat. It is a window into the brutal calculus of survival, and the permanent scars it leaves on the human spirit. His actions in the sky were born of desperation and a fierce loyalty to his crew, a moment of terrifying violence that saved lives. But his journey through occupied France revealed a different, quieter kind of courage, found in the faces of those who risked everything for strangers. If this story of sacrifice, from the frozen skies to the shadowy resistance networks, moved you, please like this video. It helps ensure these complex, human stories are not lost to time. Subscribe for more forgotten World War II stories that go beyond the headlines and into the hearts of those who lived them. Comment where you're watching from, Texas, Germany, Australia. It's a powerful reminder that the echoes of this war are felt across the globe, even today. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.